All right, welcome everyone. My name is Lauren Abner and I'm the Technology Consultant for KDLA. Today we're going to talk about the Emergency Connectivity Fund, just to give you an overview of the information from the final rules and also talk about some things you can be doing right now to prepare to apply for that funding. In the full page slides that I'll make available after the presentation, there will be hyperlinks where you can jump to different sections of the presentation, and of course the hyperlinks throughout will work. So let's start with some basics about the Emergency Connectivity Fund, or the ECF. We'll be talking a lot about two particular agencies. I'll refer to them over and over. So just like the E-rate program, the ECF will be governed by the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. So they make up the rules and they are the final authority on what goes or not with this particular program. Daily administration, including preparing the various forms to be filed, processing forms, handling just the day-to-day tasks to operate the program, will be the Universal Service Administrative Company, or USAC. So again, you're just going to hear FCC and USAC a lot. The Emergency Connectivity Fund was created by the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law on March 11th, 2021. The purpose of the ECF is to address the connectivity gap, sometimes referred to as the homework gap, that prevents library patrons or students from getting the connectivity they need to engage in remote learning and other educational purposes. So the FCC has the responsibility of implementing this program. They had 60 days from when the law was signed to release the program rules. So on May 11th, they made those available. And I'll just add a link in the chat. So if you want to look at the rules in full, you can. So this is where the Emergency Connectivity Fund starts to differ from the E-rate program that we're more familiar with. The overall fund has $7.171 billion. This is a one-time federal allotment. So this means that once the funding is exhausted or the pandemic emergency ends, that's the end of this funding. It's not going to renew each year the way E-rate does. It also means because it's a federal allotment, the funds have to be handled a little bit differently than the E-rate program. And that's because E-rate is funded through fees applied to telecommunications invoices rather than allotment of federal tax dollars. The Emergency Connectivity Fund will provide 100% discounts on eligible costs. There are certain restrictions that we'll talk about, but this is not going to be like the E-rate program where you have a set discount rate and you have to pay the difference. The idea is to try to cover 100% of the cost for eligible equipment and services. Now, the proviso is that in any particular filing window for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, if the demand exceeds the available funds, then the applications will be funded according to a special fund prioritization matrix. So this is somewhat similar to what you've seen with the E-rate discount matrix, but there is more of an advantage to rural schools and libraries compared to urban libraries. And what will happen is they'll look at the top bracket, in this case 95% for rural schools and libraries with a certain amount of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, and they will attempt to fund all of those applications first. So 100% funding to all the schools and libraries in that bracket. And then they'll move down to 90% and try the same thing, and then 85 and on and on. So they'll keep doing that until they get to a tier where they can't fully fund everyone, and then they will start looking at the actual percentage of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, and they'll do that until the funds are exhausted. Hopefully we won't get to that point. I'm really hopeful that in the first filing window, everyone will be fully funded. Now, here's another big difference from E-rate. For those of you who have requested E-rate discounts in the past, you know that generally you have to go through a competitive bidding process by filing a Form 470, where you say, hey providers, here are the eligible services that my library needs for the coming year. So the ECF does not require a formal bidding document. It's not filing a Form 470. You just have to follow state, local, or tribal procurement requirements. So if you have kind of a local purchase policy, you can follow that. Obviously, if you were trying to do 30,000 plus in procurements, then you might have to worry about buying off a state contract or going through some kind of sealed bidding process for that. But in general, you're just following your library's purchase rules. Do keep in mind, though, that we have to make sure that service providers have a SPIN, a Service Provider Identification Number. That indicates that they're set up to participate in E-rates, the ECF, and other universal service programs governed by the FCC. And for cellular data providers like AT&T Mobility, Verizon, Bluegrass Cellular, all of those kind of companies, they've got SPINs because they're already doing this for E-rate. It may be a little bit more of a challenge for a company that's going to sell you laptops because they may or may not be participating in E-rate Category 2. And this is just a general thing to keep in mind, similar to E-rate. You can't accept, gifts, gratuities, favors from service providers that are going to participate in the Emergency Connectivity Fund. There are particular limits set for, small items of little intrinsic value. Keep in mind that your local ethics rules or your own library policy may be even more restrictive about what you can accept. So if your library's own policy is more restrictive, you should follow those rules. There is currently a COVID-19 pandemic exception for service providers to provide broadband, devices, networking equipment, etc., for the purpose of addressing remote learning needs. Although with this particular program getting ready to start, I kind of don't see a lot of service providers wanting to give this away for free when possibly they can sell it to somebody who's going to apply for ECF discounts. I don't know. We'll see. Greg has a question. So we can use existing contracts that followed proper local state procurement process so long as the vendor has a valid SPIN. Yes, Greg, that's correct. If you've already set up the contract and that vendor has a SPIN, you should be able to go ahead and purchase off that. Excellent question. Okay, and then there's just a few things I want you to keep in mind. Kind of the good and the bad before we get too far into this presentation. So on the good side of the ECF, we're talking about 100% discounts. We're not used to getting that level of discounts from an FCC program, so that's pretty cool. Also, the process is going to be somewhat familiar for libraries that have already applied for E-rate because we'll be using modified versions of existing E-rate forms. Also, once the pandemic emergency ends, your library can use the equipment purchased through the ECF for really any educational purpose that your library deems appropriate or fit. And educational purposes can be defined pretty broadly, so basically you can use the equipment in it for any purpose that your library really sees fit after the emergency ends. On the not so good side, we're going to talk about a few things that may make it a little bit less enticing to accept the funding because there's more administrative burden. So we're going to talk about some requirements like patron signature on a statement of need in order to borrow the equipment or use the service. And there's also a part in the required inventory where you will likely have to store the patron's full name if they're borrowing that equipment funded by the ECF. Don't worry, we will get more into both of those items. As I already mentioned, it may be difficult to find service providers that participate in E-rate or the ECF and already have that ID number they need, particularly if you're looking for a company to sell you laptops or tablets. And we just have a short time to get everything together, figure out what we need, go through some kind of procurement process, and then fill out the application. This is all happening much more quickly than we're used to with federal programs. So next up, let's talk about where you can use these services and how they can be used. All right, so eligibility for the ECF is just like E-rate in the sense that you have to be eligible to receive funding from the Library Services and Technology Act as determined by your state library. So in the chat, I just added a link to KDLA's library determination documents. So first, KDLA has defined what a public library is in the state of Kentucky, about how your library was established, having an organized collection, having paid trained staff, having a schedule for service, the facilities necessary to provide service, and being supported at least in part by public funding. Also, we have gone further to identify what an eligible public library is. So basically, you have to meet the definition from the previous slide, and the library director needs to be properly certified. So most libraries, this won't be an issue. There may be a few that are working on some certification issues. If you're not sure about your library's eligibility, please feel free to contact me, your regional consultant. Someone at KDLA will help you determine if there's anything you need to do to become eligible. Now here's where things really differ from the E-rate program. So for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, the purpose is to help with kind of remote learning needs, remote educational needs where maybe the patron or the student doesn't have sufficient access at home. So that means that for the services funded by the Emergency Connectivity Fund, they are going to be occurring off library property. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase off-campus use because this program is kind of dominated like schools, sort of like E-rate. So it sounds a little bit funny, but basically we're talking about some other location than the library. And in the final rules for the ECF, some examples were given, like homes, community centers, churches, buses, bookmobiles, and just any other off-campus location where people are engaging and learning. I did want to put a note though, and this is something I need to investigate more with USAC and or the FCC. Part of the rules say that you can't apply for things that are eligible for E-rates. So if I've understood this correctly, that means you wouldn't be able to use emergency connectivity funds for providing hotspot service for the bookmobile because in Kentucky, that's already E-rate eligible. There are some states that, based on the way they define eligibility, you can't get cellular data discounts for the bookmobile, but in Kentucky, we say, hey, this is just like a full branch of the library. This is necessary for providing service to our rural homebound patrons. So treat it just like it's a full library branch. So I think you should be able to apply for laptops or tablets to use on the bookmobile, but I'm thinking you won't be able to get the hotspot service since that's eligible in Kentucky. However, let's just put a little note beside that, stick a pin in it. I may come back with more particular information later. And then the funds have to be used to provide equipment or services for educational purposes. This is, again, language from the E-rate program. So it must be used primarily for educational purposes, defined as activities that are integral, immediate, and proximate to the provision of library services to library patrons in the case of a library. So of course, that can be interpreted pretty broadly, but they do make you certify that you're getting funding that's going to support educational purposes. Now here's the part where we start getting into some requirements that might make you pause. So in the final rules, the FCC decided that libraries are going to have to certify that they're getting funding for equipment or services to patrons who really need them. So a requirement for this program is that, say in your user policy or some kind of agreement they sign before checking out the Wi-Fi hotspot or checking out the laptop. They're going to have to sign something to indicate that without this library service, the patron wouldn't have sufficient access in order to meet their educational needs. So it's the kind of thing where I assume most libraries have some kind of user agreement, so it's going to be something kind of tacked on at the bottom, and then you'll need to save that statement for a long time because Emergency Connectivity Fund documentation rules are 10 years. So that's just, an extra little hoop that you have to jump through. So now let's talk about the services themselves. What can you actually get emergency connectivity funding for? First up, let's talk eligible equipment. Wi-Fi hotspot devices. In this case, we're talking about the hardware itself, not the monthly cellular data plan. There is a limit on the hotspot hardware. ECF will cover up to $250 per device. So if you're buying a piece of hotspot hardware that's more expensive, you're just going to be out the difference. You can also get modems, which include air cards that could be plugged into a laptop, routers, devices that combine a modem and router, and the one I think is going to entice a lot of people would be connected devices, meaning laptops and tablets. There is a device limit of $400. So again, if you're getting a laptop that's more expensive, you're just going to be out the difference. I do want to note that there is a waiver when you're purchasing devices for people with disabilities. Maybe it's more expensive to get a device that really supports certain accessibility features. So in that case, you would need to request a waiver of the program rules from the FCC and give a reason about why this particular device that costs more than $400 should be funded in full. Also, along with this equipment, things like cords and chargers that are just included are also covered, just anything that you actually need to make the equipment operate. Also, if you've got a bundled warranty that goes with the purchase, like let's say you get a 1-year warranty when you purchase a Chromebook, that's fine if that's all bundled in with the cost. If it has a separately identifiable cost, like a service plan that you tack on, then that wouldn't be eligible because it's unbundled. So bundled warranty is good, unbundled warranty is bad. And this is a bit wordy, but we've now come to advanced telecommunications and information services, otherwise known as ways to get on the internet. So really any commercial type of internet service is potentially eligible for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, keeping in mind that we're doing off-campus or off-library property use. So that could be cable internet, copper DSL, could be fiber, satellite, wireless, and that would include a fixed wireless solution, which might be useful in a rural area, microwave, not a popular choice in Kentucky as far as I'm aware, and then the biggie would be mobile broadband. So that would be the cellular data plan that goes with a hotspot device. There's also the possibility, if there really isn't a commercially available option, to do some kind of construction to build out a network to make the services available. I just don't see that being something that we're really going to get into, especially on this kind of time frame. And then under miscellaneous, we've got installation, taxes, shipping, and other reasonable charges. Now, there are some ways that USAC is going to have to control the costs eligible for the program. We already talked about the device limit. So again, for a Wi-Fi hotspot hardware, $250 per device. For a laptop or tablet, $400 per device. So we have a question from Matt. Can you build out a service into the larger community of homes, or is it necessary that it be some other type of establishment you are building to? Matt, well, I think as long as you can get permission to set up service at that location, you could provide, say Wi-Fi to surrounding homes from some, like if you added a fiber line to a particular location. So I think the challenge would be, since it's not library property, do you have permission of whichever property it's going to be sitting on? Can you work with the owner of that property in order to set up that particular service? And also keep in mind, you could get that service covered for the next year. Based on the way funding is going to be handled, I would be kind of iffy on whether or not you could get a second year of discounts. But excellent question. All right, back to reasonable costs. I don't think this is going to be an issue for libraries, but you can't get more than one device or laptop, tablet for your patrons. So while there's not a particular budget cap, you do have to keep it within the number of patrons you actually serve. I think that's more of a requirement for schools that might be doing one-to-one device programs, like providing Chromebooks to all of their students. They can't purchase extras in case some get broken or things like that. I think for a library and what we can realistically handle to circulate, I don't see us coming anywhere near this particular limit. For devices that don't have a particular limit, like the modems and routers, USAC will just assess whether or not the requests are in line with what other patrons or other libraries are requesting. So if it seems like the thing you're requesting is way more expensive than anybody else is asking for, they're going to give you more scrutiny. So you'll have to prove why, yeah, this is more expensive, but this is really what we need to get. And then there's no double dipping. So basically, if you already got CARES Act funding or funding from KDLA, some other kind of grant, basically, if you've already had a way to pay for these particular services, you already got that funding in another way, you can't turn around and ask for emergency connectivity funding too. This seems pretty obvious, but there are people out there who will legitimately try to do this, so we just need to point that out. And also, again, you cannot request discounts on equipment and services that are eligible for E-rate discounts. So as an example, you can't get a router for your library building because that's eligible for E-rate. And then also, the service location is a problem for the Emergency Connectivity Fund. All right, let's see what we know about the upcoming application and the windows for submitting those applications. This is where we speculate a little bit because we haven't actually seen the forms yet. Before we move on, another question from Matt. Provided the grant you have received is not specifically for those services and devices, then it should be fine to apply for ECF as well. That's correct. So if you just got some kind of general grant and it wasn't specifically to cover hotspot service or laptops to circulate, then that wouldn't count. So you could apply for Emergency Connectivity Fund in that case. We might want to talk more about the specifics, but that should be okay. All right, so for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, we're going to reuse the good old Form 471 that we know and love from the E-rate program. Why, yes, I am being sarcastic. So for the ECF, we're going to be using a modified version of the form, and you will be filing it in the E-rate Productivity Center. You'll have to make different certifications than you're used to for E-rate, although there is some overlap. Basically that you, the filer, are authorized to act on behalf of the library. And if you make false statements on the application, you can be subject to legal repercussions like fines, forfeiture, imprisonment. So don't lie on the form. If you don't comply with the Emergency Connectivity Fund rules, then your funding could be denied or canceled. That your library is eligible for the ECF. That you're in compliance with any state or local bidding rules. That you're only seeking support for equipment or services that will be used for educational needs of your patrons. And then you need to create and maintain a certain inventory for the equipment and services. We're going to get into that a little bit later. So for the filing windows, we are going to start off with an initial window for prospective or upcoming purchases. So this filing window will be for purchases that will be made between July 1st of 2021 and June 30th of 2022. The application is supposed to open sometime next month. We're guessing mid to late June, and then the window will remain open for 45 days. So that's a bit faster than we're used to with E-rate, but given that you don't have to go through the formal bidding process, probably not too bad. Now, after this initial window, assuming that there's any funding still left, we have two options for the second window. If the FCC thinks that the demand was lower than it should have been, they may open a second window for prospective purchases. But they may instead just go on to a window for retrospective purchases. So this will cover eligible expenses your library had from March 1st of 2020 to June 30th of 2021. So that might be a good opportunity if you've already got Wi-Fi hotspot or laptop lending going. That might be a good way to recoup costs that you've already incurred. Of course, I think the challenge will be, again, that spin. Were you getting equipment or services from a provider with a spin? That could be a challenge in some cases. Of course, right now, we don't really know exactly what the demand will be. We've never had a nationwide program of this magnitude. And we know there's not enough funding to connect every student or library patron that doesn't have the internet. So I think the E-rate community is feeling pretty good about that first window for prospective purchases. I think most, if not all, applicants will be fully funded. I'd say if we get to that second retrospective window for past purchases, if we get there, that window is probably going to exhaust all available funds because so many school districts were doing one-to-one device programs. I just don't see it lasting beyond that. Question from Jan, will the schools not apply for this? Will they be trying to do the same thing they are? So yes, schools are eligible for the Emergency Connectivity Fund. I've been talking about the library perspective, but yes, just like E-rates, we're dealing with the schools as well. And I think given the number of students they're trying to serve, that will really limit, how much funding people are really going to get out of this program. But for the first window, since it's prospective and so many school districts already have laptops, how many more can they really buy? Okay, gotcha. Just making sure you're not kind of overlapping with what the school is doing. And Greg mentions that Louisville is in a conversation with the school system for exactly that reason. And then from David, it sounded like data plans for hotspots are covered outside of the $250 device hardware. Do we know what monetary limits will be on data plans? You're correct, David, that the $250 device limit for hotspots just pertains to the hardware. There's not a hard limit set on data plans. I saw some discussion in the rules about like, oh, we figure these plans will cost, $10 to $25 per month, which I think is wildly unrealistic. But they didn't set a specific limit because we know that cellular connectivity is just a lot more expensive in some places. We know if you're using Appalachian Wireless in southeastern Kentucky, it's just going to cost a lot more than using T-Mobile or AT&T. Excellent. All right, so moving on. There are a few things you can do after receiving a commitment to make some changes. It is possible to request a service substitution. So let's say that you originally had an agreement to buy some hotspots from one vendor, and then the vendor's just not able to deliver on that. You could maybe switch to another vendor, and then you could request that service substitution to correct the information on your application. Just keep in mind that it needs to be the same functionality. So, cellular data plan for cellular data plan is fine, but you are limited to the amount that was originally committed to your library. So if the new service is more expensive, you're just going to be out the difference. If the new service is less expensive, you'll just get your 100% discount on that new lower cost. You have 30 days to file an appeal with USAC following any of their decisions. So if you think a mistake was made on the funding commitment decision letter, revised funding commitment decision letter, if an invoicing form was rejected and it shouldn't have been, you can file an appeal with USAC. If you get denied on that appeal, you can then appeal to the FCC within another 30 days. Also, if you are asking for any kind of waiver of the program rules, you'll need to file that request directly with the Federal Communications Commission. Now on to invoicing. There'll be some differences here, but it'll be largely similar to E-rate. So just like the E-rate program, you're going to have two options for invoicing for the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So one option is the BEAR form, or the FCC Form 472, and that would be where your library has paid the full cost up front and is then filing for reimbursement via direct deposit. The other option is to get the vendor to apply a discount up front and then bill you the difference, assuming there's anything that you owe. The vendor would then file a SPI form to be reimbursed by the program. Keep in mind though, with the ECF, vendors are not obligated to offer service provider invoicing as an option. So if they happen to do it, that's great, but you can't demand that they do it. Let's see, question from Jan. An adult going back to school, a college student, or someone studying for licensing would qualify as well as school kids. Well, Jan, I mean, if library patrons are using, say, a hotspot or a laptop loan from the library for those purposes, that certainly qualifies as an educational use, but you don't have to be so restrictive with educational purposes. So it's not literally, I am taking a class right now. I am engaging in remote learning. It can be much broader because it might be that a patron is, learning some computer skills to apply for a job, or using some of the library's databases, or just anything that happens to be educational. And as long as they sign a statement that they're, primarily using this for educational purposes, who are we to question? I like that. I am researching how Mario Kart works. Well, unfortunately, we're not funding game systems, but I don't know if there's a way to play Mario Kart online, but sounds educational to me. Of course, remember, I am not USAC or the FCC, so I can easily be overruled in these regards. So back to invoicing. So you've got your two options, the BEAR form or the SPI form. Now, one requirement that's a little bit different is that at the time that an ECF invoicing form is filed, whether it's the BEAR or the SPI form, you have to submit a copy of the vendor's invoice where it shows the line items with the eligible services or equipment that you purchased. So I'm not sure how that mechanism is going to work because the existing BEAR form doesn't really have that functionality. So I don't know if you'll be emailing it somewhere or there's going to be some kind of, I don't know, Dropbox for that, but somehow you'll be submitting an actual copy of the invoice. Now, there is an option for prior payment. So if you know that your library is going to have to, file a BEAR form, the vendor's not going to apply the discount up front. You can actually request payment from the Emergency Connectivity Fund before you pay the service provider, but you have to make sure that within 30 days of getting that funding, you provide verification of your payment. So that's a nice option that normally we don't have with E-rate. All right, for invoicing dates, assuming you've received your funding commitment for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, invoicing can begin as soon as 15 days after the first wave of funding. So you can start getting your refunds pretty quickly. The invoicing deadline is tighter than we have with the E-rate program. So you have 60 days from your funding commitment or the service delivery date to file your invoicing form. It goes by whichever date is later. Now, there is some trickiness with recurring services that I need to check into. But for example, if you bought some laptops, then you have 60 days from the date you bought those laptops to get that invoicing done, unless you bought them before you got your funding commitment, in which case you've got 60 days from the funding commitment. So you've just got to make sure that you're on the ball with that, because there's not as much leeway with the date as we have with the E-rate program. And I haven't read anything yet that says you can request an invoice deadline extension. An extra requirement is that your library will have to register with sam.gov, which is the System for Award Management, in order to receive disbursements from the Emergency Connectivity Fund. So again, this is required because this is a federal allotment versus the telecommunications fees that fund the E-rate program. So if you're at all thinking about going through this process to get emergency connectivity funding, you may want to go ahead and start the process of setting up your library in this system if you're not already registered, because it can take up to 20 days for registrations to become active. So you'll need to create your own user account, and then within your profile, you can set up a particular entity. Once you've set up an account with sam.gov, you can use their search feature. And the search feature only works if you have a registered account. You can search by the DUNS number to determine if your library is already set up in that system. So just to restate, because I know that's confusing, you don't have to be affiliated with any particular entity in order to create an account with sam.gov. In fact, I just made an account today, and I'm not tied in with KDLA or any other library system. But you need to be registered with sam.gov, have your own access account in order to use their search feature. With the search feature, you pop in your library's DUNS number, and it'll pull results. And if you're already registered, you'll see your library listed in the results. Let's see. Looking at the questions here, let's see, we just got an update on that program. If you have ever registered with SAM, I hope you didn't let it run out. It took us forever to get re-registered. So thanks for the comment, Jan. That is taking some time. Oh, sorry, Greg, sorry, yours is expired. It looks like you'll need to go through that process again. I'm sorry, yes, sad face for that. Okay, and then from Joel, it was only a few days for renewal. So you're seeing the spectrum of reactions there. So that's definitely something you want to go ahead and look into in case it is going to take a little bit longer to set your library up initially or to re-register if your registration has expired. CIPA compliance, my favorite topic. This law. I always think I've gotten to the point where I don't really need to talk about CIPA anymore, and then something else happens. I will never, ever escape CIPA. It's great. Doesn't bother me at all. So a lot of libraries in Kentucky, in fact, about 90% of libraries already comply with the Children's Internet Protection Act. It's required for most of the equipment or services you purchase through the E-rate program. It's also required when you're getting LSTA funding from our agency, depending on what you're purchasing. So, most of you are already CIPA compliant, but there are some situations where it won't be required. Now, CIPA is definitely required if your library is receiving E-rate discounts on internet access, internet service, or internal connections, which basically means anything Category 2. So if you're already applying for E-rate and you're getting those discounts, you still have to be CIPA compliant. You also have to be CIPA compliant if you're going to get emergency connectivity funding for discounts on internet access or internet service. So that would be the cellular data plan for your hotspots, or maybe some kind of internet line for a non-library location. let's see. Also, if you get support for connected devices like laptops or tablets, you have to comply with SIPA if you're also getting either E-rate or emergency connectivity funding for an internet service. I hope that's clear. If not, please ask questions. Now here's the part where things get interesting. There are situations where a library can apply for this funding even though they are not SIPA compliant. So you need to meet all these conditions. If your library isn't getting E-rate funding for something that requires SIPA compliance, so you're not getting internet discounts, you're not getting Category 2 equipment discounts, that's one part. If you're not going to use emergency connectivity fund for the internet service itself, then you could potentially request discounts on connected devices like laptops and tablets if they're not going to connect to some kind of internet source that is funded either by the E-rate program or the emergency connectivity fund. So again, if you're just requesting, the connected devices and really not anything else, then your library could get emergency connectivity funding. So this might be an opportunity for, say, Lexington Public Library. They're not SIPA compliant. They only get E-rate discounts for the transport circuits that connect their branches. So they could get some discounts on more laptops for their lending program, and that doesn't trigger SIPA compliance. So there might be a few libraries out there that can jump in and get this funding and not have to comply with SIPA if they have intellectual freedom grounds where they don't want to engage in filtering. Just a unique opportunity here. Just very briefly, a reminder that in order to be SIPA compliant, there are 3 steps. You need to have implemented an internet safety policy that addresses certain aspects of children's safe use of the library's internet. At some point before you put that policy into effect, you needed to have given notice about a public hearing where your community could comment on the policy. And then you have to implement a technology protection measure, which is a fancy way of saying you actually filter your internet for certain visual images. Oh, David, I love dumb questions. Let's go for it. How do you make sure cellular data plans on hotspots will be SIPA compliant? Well, David, there are a couple of different ways to go about it. With SIPA compliance, it's really about the library-owned computers rather than the internet source itself. So if you have a library-owned laptop, for example, that you're loaning to a patron, you could potentially just have some sort of filtering software installed on the laptop itself and not filter the hotspot. But I know some providers do offer SIPA filtering. Like I think Sprint, which I guess is now T-Mobile, I remember they have some kind of SIPA filtering option. So you might want to check with your provider. Potentially that would be an additional fee. And I don't think that additional fee for SIPA filtering would be eligible. Actually, I'm sure that additional fee wouldn't be eligible. If it happens to be bundled in with the service itself, you should be good to go. And again, it's all about the library-owned computers, including the ones that are actually inside your building. I know that seems weird, but any library-owned computers have to have filtered internet access. But how you go about it can be different. It can be on the computer itself, or it can be filtering the internet source that that laptop or that computer is connecting to. And we can talk more about SIPA. In fact, I'm thinking I'm going to have to redo my SIPA webinar because it's been 4 years, and more little nuances keep coming up every day. So I think you guys would really appreciate an opportunity to take that training again. All right, glad that was helpful to you guys. Okay, Matt, I will keep it in mind. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to redo it. I'm just not sure when I'm going to get around to it. It'll probably be sometime this summer. Okay. Let's see. Let's talk about inventory and document retention. So for the Emergency Connectivity Fund, just like E-rate, the document retention period is 10 years after the last date of service or the delivery of equipment. So you get to keep everything for a really long time. So for the most part, I would think for this upcoming window, when we're talking about July 1st of 2021 to June 30th of 2022, you're going to need to keep all of that documentation until at least June 30th of 2032. Super long time. Hopefully it'll be somebody else's problem by the time we get to that retention period, but who knows? So stuff you might need to keep includes bids, contracts, or the invoices for your services, any FCC forms you file, like the application form or an invoicing form, any other official notices from USAC or the FCC. That might be something like your funding commitment decision letter. The inventory, which we are finally going to talk about coming up in just a moment. And those patron statements are to talk about using the equipment or service for educational purposes. You need to keep hold of that. And then, of course, if you have documentation regarding CIPA compliance about how you actually filtered, some kind of log showing that, your computers were filtered, your internet safety policy, documentation about your public hearing, you'll need to keep that as well. Also, for the equipment itself, you're not allowed to sell it, resell it, transfer it, or get rid of it until the equipment is at least 3 years old. At that point, it would be deemed obsolete, and then you can, get rid of it however you'd like to. So that's a little bit more lenient than the E-rate program, so that's pretty nice. Okay, on to these lovely inventories. So basically, you've got two different types of inventories. One is for equipment, and then the other is for services. And then they're further differentiated by whether or not you're providing service to an individual patron versus multiple users. So for example, if you are loaning equipment like a hotspot or a laptop to an individual patron, say with your lending program, then the inventory has to include the type of device, the make and model of the device, the serial number for the device, the full name of the person to whom the device or other piece of equipment was provided, and then the dates the device or equipment was loaned out and returned to the library, or the dates that you were notified that it's missing, lost, or damaged. So this is where it gets trickier because our systems are not really set up to keep a record of who borrowed what. They turn it back in and then it goes off the record because we don't care about that, because we like patron privacy. But the FCC was not persuaded by arguments that were made after the draft rules were released. So unfortunately, if you're going to get emergency connectivity funds, you're going to need to track the patrons that use the hotspot, use the laptop. And that's again for individual lending. So you were letting that particular patron have that particular device or laptop for a period of time, you get to track that. And then similarly, if you're providing a service to an individual library patron, you'll be tracking some information. So the type of service, details about the data plan, the upload download speeds, the monthly data cap, things like that, the name of the person to whom the service was provided. And then if it's a fixed broadband solution, like, I don't know, you were paying for an individual patron to have cable internet or fiber internet set up at their home, something like that, then you would have to also keep the service delivery address, installation date of the service, and the last date of service. I don't think too many libraries would do fixed broadband solutions for individual patrons, but perhaps the demand is higher than I anticipate. I mostly think about this for Wi-Fi hotspots. And then going over to the multiple user side. So if you've got a device that's going to be used only on the bookmobile, for example, you've got a laptop that multiple users along the bookmobile route might access. In that case, you're having to keep some basic information about the device, the name of the library employee in charge of that device, and the dates that equipment was in service. So that would just be for any device or equipment that multiple people are accessing, on any given day. it's not loaned out to a particular person. And then for some kind of service that is provided to multiple users, like maybe a community Wi-Fi option, let's say you might pay for a hotspot that's installed at a local church, or you're paying for an internet connection that goes to a local fire station, and then houses in that area can access Wi-Fi off that particular connection. You know, one of those scenarios. Then again, you're just keeping some basic details about the service, the employee who is in charge of the service, and then if it's a fixed broadband solution, some other details about the service delivery address and installation and things like that. Now, with this information, it's possible that USAC or the FCC could require you to provide information during an audit. So in most instances, USAC or the FCC would try to use anonymized or de-identified information, so you don't have to say, which particular patron, was using this service. But there is a possibility, if for audit purposes they really need to know the individuals who used it, they could ask you for that information, but the library would have to obtain consent from the patron in order to share personally identifiable information. So that's just kind of a weird, hurdle to jump through. Alex has a really good question. Oh, sorry, my voice just came back in my ear very loudly for a moment. How long do you have to continue to track patrons? The lifetime of the device, 3 years? I would say that's going to depend, and this is one of the things that ALA is looking into in regards to compliance with this program. I would say if you are circulating a hotspot or device, something like that, during the next year, you're going to, of course, have to track it all during that year. Let's say the pandemic ends, is declared over this fall, and then we're out of the emergency period, and you're not getting more funding for that anyway. I would say you would be able to stop doing the tracking at that point. But I'm not sure if, let's say you got funding in the first year to purchase a piece of equipment, if you have to keep track of that in years 2 and 3, even though you're not getting more funding for it. I'm really not sure about that. So that's something else I'll have to find out for our next webinar. Excellent question. Okay, what can we do to prepare for the Emergency Connectivity Fund? Because we know the application window hasn't been announced yet, but there are definitely things we can go ahead and be doing to get ourselves ready. So you may want to think about any additional costs. Can your library afford to pay for various accessories or some software for the laptops or anything else you might need to get your lending program off the ground? Because with the laptops, the cord would be covered because you need that to actually make the laptop work, but you can't request funding on laptop carrying cases. So could you pay for those if you needed them? If you needed some other kind of case to hold the hotspot when it's being loaned to a patron, that's just going to be out of your pocket. So are you ready for all those costs? Also keep in mind that you're requesting discounts for what's going to go into use. You're not requesting discounts for some spares that are going to be sitting somewhere just in case a patron, breaks the laptop. So make sure you're ready for those extra expenses. And, are you really going to want to continue this service past the first year of funding? Because again, based on the amount of funding and these filing window options, I'm not seeing us getting to a funding year 2022 for the Emergency Connectivity Fund. I hope to be wrong, but that's kind of iffy. So maybe you just want to experiment and start a program for 1 year and see how it goes. But if you're really wanting to do this longer term, just keep in mind that you need to find some other way to pay for it when you get to year 2. Question from Matt: what software might classify as eligible versus ineligible? Well, I would think any additional software to be installed that isn't basically the operating system itself or something that just comes bundled with the cost. Anything else you tack on is not going to be eligible for discounts from this program. So if you need to separately buy the Microsoft Office suite or some kind of tracking or filtering software, that's just going to be out of pocket for the library. Firewall, anti-theft, not included then. That would be correct. Now, in this case, you're not going to be able to get funding for firewall, tracking for anti-theft, anything like that. It's not going to be eligible. Let's see. In addition to the funds you might need to get your program off the ground or keep it running, you do need to make sure that you're going to be working with a vendor that has a SPIN, that service provider identification number, because you're not going to be able to list that vendor on an application, and you won't be able to complete the invoicing form without a SPIN. And people are poking around to see if there is something that can be done, especially for the retrospective purchases. But the more I've thought about it, the more I think USAC and the FCC aren't going to let us get out of the requirement to have a vendor with a SPIN because of all of the audits and program integrity assurance. They're going to want to know that it's a legitimate vendor that they can contact to verify that a library or school has actually paid for a service. Make sure you've got access to any online systems that you'll be using. So I assume that most ECF filers are going to be the people who fill out the E-rate forms, but maybe not. If you need access to the E-rate Productivity Center, go ahead and get that up and running. A question from Joel: is there a vendor list for those that have SPINs? Joel, I'll have to think about that. I'm not sure if there's a way to export vendors in a particular state. I think there might be, but I don't think there's a good way to just kind of track down any vendor nationally. It's on my to-do list to maybe try to figure out some vendors that participate in E-rates and sell stuff that would be eligible for the ECF. Right offhand, I'm thinking about vendors like CDWG or SHI. But also some local vendors may be willing to sell equipment. I know for E-rate, we've bought things like switches, firewalls, access points, but some of those vendors might be able to sell a laptop instead. Let's see, question from Greg. Is there a realistic chance that vendors are actually going to be able to meet all of this concurrent billing as of July 1st demand for mobile service and devices, especially given the short time frame? I would say, Greg, that I am a little bit pessimistic, as you seem to be, given the number of schools and libraries that may want to start service and current shortages for hotspot hardware. I think it might be hard to set up some of those services by July 1st, in which case you may end up asking for an adjustment of your ECF funding, if your service actually can't begin until September or October. Yeah, it's going to be interesting, how vendors can keep up with this possible demand. Why, yes, Greg, you were that obvious. I know you so well. You're similarly pessimistic. Okay. Let's see. So in addition to E-rate Productivity Center access, you may need a PIN for accessing the legacy invoicing system. And again, you may want to get registered with the System for Award Management. Also think about whether you really have the staff time and resources to handle a lending program. I certainly don't want to discourage anybody, but your staff are going to have to learn new procedures. There are different things you'll have to do to handle these devices, especially laptops. So is that a time commitment your staff can take on? Do they have the expertise to try to maintain these devices? You might want to talk to other Kentucky libraries about the programs they've established, or potentially even your local school district. I know a couple of you mentioned that earlier. You may want to turn to their expertise, say at loaning Chromebooks, for example. Also, you may want to think about your library policies, especially the user agreement for borrowing a hotspot or laptop. You might need to create one or revise one. And then, for inventory, are you able to keep up with the inventory requirements, especially for getting the names of individual patrons who have borrowed something from you? Let's see. It looks like there's a question I have missed. Oh, I see. Let me go back to Matt's question that I skipped. is it potentially reasonable to try and get funding for a hotspot program that you aren't sure if you can continue after funding is gone? Like, would you want to use this as an opportunity to show local funders how successful that program is to try and secure future funding? Matt, I think that's a great idea, and that's definitely feasible. I'm sure that is part of the purpose here, is just to try these programs to see how well they address the connectivity gap. So if you want to use that to show, hey, we've had success with this, will you give us funding to continue? I think that would be great. Excellent question. And I'm a little bit over time, but I'm just going to keep going. Also, just keep in mind with this funding that there are strings attached. There's no such thing as really free money or free products, free services. There usually is some other sort of cost and time or hassle that you have to deal with. And also, if you don't really need these funds, don't feel that you're obligated to apply for them. That will just leave the funding available for libraries and schools that really need it. Okay, we've got a note from Alex. This is really good. Be careful about talking to schools about Chromebooks. The schools have a completely different model of how Google domain users work, and it's not applicable for most libraries. All right, thank you for the heads up, Alex. That's a great comment. Okay, so wrapping up just a smidge over time. There are some basic places to get information about the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Obviously, the program administrator, USAC, is going to have information on its website. Very soon, they are going to start a separate call center that deals specifically with Emergency Connectivity Fund questions. You may want to contact regular customer service, though, if you're having any difficulties with getting into the E-Rate Productivity Center. Also, consulting groups like E-Rate Central and Funds for Learning have newsletters, and they'll be talking about the Emergency Connectivity Fund. ALA also has some resources and will be offering some things pretty soon. They have a summary of the Emergency Connectivity Fund that, it's just a little bit different than what I put together, so you can read that online. They also are planning for a Q&A webinar on June 7th. They're also working on some choose-your-own adventure guides for things like using Wi-Fi in a bookmobile, hotspot lending, setting up internet service for somebody's home. So they're going to hopefully release those guides pretty soon. So that might give you information about setting up a program for the first time. And in the chat, Kim has asked, do any of you circulate Chromebooks outside the building, and how do you filter? So if any of you are doing Chromebook lending, maybe let Kim know in the chat. Okay, so Alex has offered to answer your questions. His email is in the chat. All right, you can also sign up for reminders directly from USAC. I'm just going to go ahead and pop this in the chat. They have just a brief online form you can fill out so that you can get automatic email reminders when they have more program information or will be offering a training opportunity. And of course, there's the good old Kentucky Tech listserv. When I get more information, I'll put notices on this listserv. And the recording of this webinar and the slides will be made available later on our archived webinars page. That brings us to the end of our presentation. I'm going to go ahead and pop the survey link into the chat. If you're watching a recording of this, we would still appreciate that you take the survey. That's helpful for us in formulating our training, and it's also kind of required for our federal funding. So we need to tell the feds just how effective our training is. So if you can fill that out, it would be great. Please feel free to contact me directly if you have questions. You can call me at lauren.abner@ky.gov, I'm typing this, or 502-564-1728. And I saw that there was a question about the certificate. It may take a week or so, but anyone who attended 75% of this presentation will get a certificate. So great question. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I can hang out for another minute and answer questions. Thank you guys so much for being such a great audience.